Hello guys, welcome back to our YouTube channel. In this video we are gonna see, what if Naruto was the unwanted fox and raised the empire? Part 3. If you want more awesome fan fiction like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. So without wasting any time, let's get into the video. As the blackness of night gave way to the first rays of the new day, a wave of shadows shot forward across the desert's edge, flinging themselves into the open plains, pushing past the scattering patches of trees as they turned towards the shadowy structure of the first western fortress. There it is. Called a feral-looking boy clothed in the standard green and black that identified Konoha forces, as beside him a massive white hound let out a bark of agreement. "Hiba, keep it down." Called a red-eyed woman dressed much the same as the feral boy gave a slightly embarrassed look before turning back towards the fortress, even as a small distance away a blonde woman let out a heavy sigh, idly jostling the massive fan on her back. "I don't like this. The first team was supposed to report back to us before morning. Damn it, I have a bad feeling about this," thought the woman, her worry apparently showing on her face as beside her a dark-skinned woman, her fiery red hair turned her to face her. "Quit your worrying, will you? It ain't helping anyone," called the redhead as Tamari turned towards her, giving her an annoyed look before continuing forwards to fall into step beside her older brother, who gave her a small nod, his black uniform billowing out in the air. "Just ignore her, we'll be there soon enough," spoke Kankuro as his sister nodded, looking ahead once again. "Yeah, it's just this whole thing is messed up," breathed the blonde as her brother nodded in agreement. "I know, but look, Gar is right, we need to be careful. If the west starts to move soon it will be the first hit," replied the man as Tamari sighed. "I just hope we haven't started that war ourselves," muttered the girl as the group pushed deeper into the forest surrounding the fortress. Soon enough Tamari and Kankuro broke through the last line of trees, only to have to jerk to a stop as the forces before them were already brought to a halt, their faces turned up at the smoking walls of the fortress. What?" managed Kankuro as Tamari's eyes went wide. Around her most of the force had similar expressions, not understanding what they were seeing. Shaking herself from these thoughts, Tamari managed to calm herself enough to get moving again. "Kankuro with me, squads 3 and 7 you two," called Tamari before she sprang forward, jumping to impact the wall of the fortress, rushing up as the shinobi and kunoichi around her rushed up after her. As the group crossed over the lip of the wall, they found themselves freezing once again as the interior of the base opened up before them. Buildings still smoldering as broken blades, kunai, and bits of armor lay scattered everywhere. The walls themselves sporting scars from weapons, fire, and justice, whole sections of the stone floor torn to pieces, and most of all shinobi and kunoichi lying in pools of their own blood scattered here and there. "Here, Kami," whispered Kurenai, looking around at the carnage, spotting one kunoichi lying face down, a sword run clean through her chest so that it stuck up like some perverse flagpole. "What the hell is this?" whispered Kiba as Kankuro pushed past the line, dropping down beside one down shinobi, examining the batch of kunai that had punched through his chest. As he shifted a hand up to close the body's eye, he turned to look back up the wall to where Tamari stood. "It's the first team, alright, they haven't been dead for more than a few hours," called the man, his painted face turning back around towards the broken buildings and bodies as he drew in a steadying breath. "Amoy," came a cry as the dark-skinned kunoichi rushed down the wall to where a body lay, two fanged blades still clutched in its hands, the head looking as though it had been torn off by some great explosion. As she rushed to her fallen teammate, falling to her knees beside the body, Tamari along with the rest of the shinobi dropped down, moving around to the shinobi, still others simply looking around at the devastation, speechless at what they were seeing. "What happened here?" mouthed Kurenai as Kiba and Akamaru sniffed the air, a frown drawing across his lips as he turned to his sensei, even as Tamari let out an angry sigh. "What's it look like? Our plan to capture the fortress has failed miserably," spat the blonde as Kankuro moved up beside her, reaching out to grab her shoulder to steady her as he looked around as well. "The place is deserted, I can't get a single scent apart from the dead," muttered Kiba, looking around as Kurenai nodded, her eyes trailing the scene again. "This isn't everyone, where is Sakura?" asked the woman, turning to Kankuro, who drew in a deep breath, giving the place a final once over as he spoke. "If I had to guess, captured along with the others. From what I've seen only the dead were left, so they may have taken the injured with them as well." "But why destroy the base?" asked Kiba as Tamari let out a sickened chuckle that drew eyes to her as she started shaking her head, turning away from the side of the base, moving back towards the wall as she spoke. "Because, dog boy, they didn't want to leave us anything, it's standard practice in war," finished Tamari as she moved up the wall to report to the other forces. Her worst fears having come to life right before her eyes. Meanwhile, within the capital of the empire, Naruto found himself sitting once again in the large meeting room, the windows now shut, closing out the happiness of the gardens, as his eyes turned from Cornelia, who stood before him, sporting a few small bandages, shifting around to where Lelich sat, his hands interlocked, as he finished listening to his sister's report. Taking in a deep breath, Naruto leaned back in his chair before speaking. "And Euphemia?" asked Naruto as Cornelia let out her own breath, moving to finally take a seat of her brow, looking slightly disheartened. She's with Nunnally now. She did all she could, but we still lost quite a few soldiers in the attack. She even insisted on stabilizing the prisoners. It's likely she'll be too exhausted to do much for a few days. Replied the purple-haired woman as Naruto nodded at the news. Hi, that sounds like her, Lelich. Asked Naruto as the black-haired man looked up from his hands, his eyes narrowed. Something doesn't add up about this. Why waste the element of surprise on such a remote outpost? If this was the first move of a war, why not target one of our stronger bases further inland? Muttered the man, looking across to his sister, who shook her head in reply. I don't know. If my company and I hadn't been there by chance, they would have doubtless taken the fortress before an alarm could have been raised, but even still it is too far from our line to make any real strategic gain. Agreed the woman as Lelich sighed, casting his eyes down at the map laid out before them, where small raised points showed their eastern border. Naruto for his part was also looking towards the map, his emotions a storm, as he considered what he had heard. Cornelia's forces had arrived at the break of dawn to bring word of the assault, yet somehow it still didn't feel real. Idly Naruto's mind flicked back to his arguments in Suna, his mind moving over the events with Tsuchikage as something sparked in his mind. What if this wasn't about the fortress? Muttered the blonde, drawing the attention of the other two. For a moment Lelich seemed puzzled until his eyes shifted back to the map before his eyes narrowed at what he was seeing. Yes, if this was an attempt to show force it would fit, the fortress is so close to the border. This was a move to make a point. Stated Lelich, turning to Cornelia as he spoke next. That's why you found the wall guards unconscious instead of dead. They wanted to capture the fortress to use as a bargaining chip. Finished the boy as Cornelia let out a small growl. Fools, that plan of theirs has already cost us the lives of several of our people. Naruto, we need to show them that we won't tolerate such action. Called Cornelia as Naruto allowed his eyes to shift over to the final two members of the group that had been silent since the opening. CC Kurama, what are your thoughts? Asked Naruto as the kitsune let out a small snort. I say we push those bastards right out of our land now. Snapped the fox as beside him CC gave a small nod. I have to agree with Kurama, whatever their goal, they have invaded our land and killed our people. We have only just gained our freedom from oppression, and I for one am not willing to let such a thing return to our lands. Finished the woman as Naruto looked around the table, seeing nods of agreement from the rest as he bowed his own head in acknowledgement of their words. You're correct, Cornelia, take a day's rest to recover and then prepare our forces to move. Lelich, inform the council and coordinate with Cornelia to push these invaders from our land. CC Kurama, please stay, I need to speak with you. Finished Naruto as the group nodded, moving to complete their tasks as the blonde found himself alone in the room looking across at the remaining pair. What's up? Asked Kurama as Naruto sighed, looking over at the fox. First Kurama, I'm sorry, but you have to stay here for now. If you are on the field, then you might be sealed again. For now I need you to stay here to look after Nunnally and CC, replied Naruto as CC looked to him, her eyes narrowed. I see you intend to go to the front. Stated the woman as Naruto nodded. Hi, I need you to stay here and manage things while I help to push back this attack. I know what you're going to say, but this force needs to be thrown out as soon as possible, and I'm more use on the front than sitting here. Spoke Naruto as CC let out a sigh, shaking her head, a small smile upon her lips. This is what we get for training you so well. Very well, we will look after the rear, just make sure that you look after yourself. Replied the green-haired woman as Naruto nodded, pushing himself up from his chair as he turned to the door. Where are you headed now? Called CC as Naruto paused, looking back sadly as his blue eyes sank, a frown marring his whiskered cheeks. To inform our guest of what has transpired, she will be staying with us for a long time in all likelihood. Replied Naruto as he moved out the room, turning down the carpeted hall, his mind running through everything he had learned as well as what was likely on the horizon. Damn you shinobi for forcing me to do this. Thought the blonde as his burnt red robes billowed out behind him. She was crying now, each tear feeling like knife into the man's heart as he watched her slowly sink onto the four-poster bed, her head shaking as if trying to will what she had been told to somehow not be true, her blue hair falling in waves around her face even as she reached her hands up to try and hold back the tears streaming from them. And he could do nothing but stand there watching her, his covered brow bowed in silence. Ooh, but why? She managed, turning her pale eyes up to Naruto, who let out a heavy breath, turning his face from hers, not being able to see that pain upon her face. We believe it was to gain a stronger position for future treaties. That is the best we can guess, at least. I am sorry to have to ask you, but were you aware of any reason for this? Asked Naruto as Hinata looked up at him, her eyes dropping as her mind tried to process what was happening. No, in Konoha the council was angry about Sasuke's injuries, but Lady Tsunade overruled them. I don't understand. Managed Hinata, still not being able to believe that her nation had moved to war even knowing she was in the empire. As this washed across her, Hinata's chest seized at what was to become of her. "Oh Kami. Why will they kill me?" thought the girl, looking up to see the emperor nodding slightly as he turned to leave. "I see, thank you Lady Hinata. For the time being please remain here, if you require anything a guard will be outside of your door. I am sure Nunnally will wish to check on you before long," spoke Naruto, his voice carrying an obvious sadness as he turned from her, moving to the door as the pale-eyed girl looked after him, unbelieving at what she had heard. "Why believe me?" managed Hinata as Naruto paused, turning his helm to her slowly as a small sigh pushed through his lips. "Because Hinata, you never were the kind of person to deceive others. It's not in your nindo after all," replied Naruto as he disappeared through the door, leaving Hinata to stare after him, blinking in confusion at his words. "Never were. My nindo? Why does the emperor know that?" wondered Hinata, looking towards the door where the man had disappeared, her mind arush with thoughts that refused to make sense. As Naruto let the door shut behind him, his heart sank at the state he had left the girl in. "You know you didn't have to tell her, one of us could," spoke a voice to his left as Naruto turned to look down the hall, spying CC watching him with a worried look on her brow. "Hi, but I felt like I needed to be the one," replied Naruto as he turned from her, moving down the hall towards his next destination, leaving the green-haired woman to sigh, her eyes moving from the retreating man to the door beside her. "Baka, you can't even tell how much you care for her already," muttered CC as she signaled a pair of guards forwards to attention at the door. After she had regained her composure, "Please send Nunnally to her. And prepare the gardens for a private meeting. I will be holding one there within the week and will not wish to be disturbed, understood?" stated CC as the armored guard snapped out a salute as he took position at the door. "Well Naruto, go and do what you have to for the empire and I'll do what I have to for you," threw CC as she turned to make her own way down the carpeted hall. Meanwhile, with a holding cell within the palace walls, a pink-haired woman found herself bound to a chair as she awaited what would not doubt be some manner of interrogation. Not that it could frighten her now, not after what had happened. Everyone, she didn't even know if anyone else had survived, and for what she wanted to get back at the empire for attacking Sasuke so much she had volunteered for the mission, and now she was here. As these thoughts pushed through her mind, a small creak drew her eyes up to see the cell door swinging open, letting a small trail of light spill into the blackened room, briefly illuminating it before a small buzz preempted lights that flickered on above her, causing her eyes to shut at the sudden blast of light. Blinking the irritation from her eyes, Sakura managed to focus her eyes only to see the familiar helm of the emperor, looking down on her two blazing blue eyes, looking at her behind the small slit eye holes. "Sakura Haruno, Jonin of Konoha and second apprentice to Tsunade, the fourth Hokage," spoke Naruto as he entered the room, drawing a small glare from the green-eyed girl as he faced her. "How did you?" she began before Naruto raised a hand. "You forget I meet with your Hokage at the tournament Haruno, and that Lady Hinata was sent her as an ambassador. I simply ask you name," replied Naruto as Sakura glared at him. "What have you done with her?" she called as the emperor shook his covered head. "Nothing, Lady Hinata is an innocent in this, and I am not in the habit of attacking without cause," replied Naruto, his words biting into Sakura as she looked away from him. "What do you want?" she spat as Naruto stepped forwards, drawing her eyes up to him as she watched her. "I want to know why did you attack my nation without provocation?" yelled Naruto, allowing his emotions to spill through for a moment, his simple fury washing over the pink-haired girl like a physical wave, shaking her severely. However, even as the fear pushed forward, so too did her anger, the faces of her comrades dying flashing across her face as she glared back at him. "Why? You attacked one of our own, you threaten us with weapons stronger than we have, and you set Suna into a panic by blasting enough energy to wipe it out, and you ask why?" yelled Sakura, panting in her rage as Naruto watched as she glared at him. "Is that why? For something so foolish? You deprive 32 men and women of their lives for that. 32 lives destroyed, sons, daughters, mother, fathers for nothing," whispered Naruto as he turned from her, moving to the door, Sakura's eyes following him. "And what about our lives? What about all of the shinobi and kunoichi you killed?" called Sakura as the emperor stopped at the door, turning his helm slowly around to look back at her. "Whom do you think I was referring to?" asked Naruto in a blank tone, his words hitting Sakura like a physical blow, her mind failing her as the emperor turned, the door closing behind him as he left her to slowly crumple behind him, her voice coming out in an audible sob as she was left alone with the reality, the price of her pride, the price of challenging the West. A few days later found the leader of the elemental nations gathered together, all looking ahead horrified as the final report came in from the now occupied fortress. Over 30 of their initial force dead, at least twice that captured or worse, and not as much as a word from the United West. With little other choice, Temari had moved her forces into the fortress, securing it while digging in around the western side that opened up onto a massive open plain that stretched on for miles, but with the few forces she had, even that seemed futile if the West made a move. As the report finished, A was the first to speak, his hands clasped before him as his eyes hardened as they turned to Temari. "And the Empire's force? You say that there has been no sight of them?" asked the man as Temari nodded in reply. "I see, so for the time we have an opening," muttered the man as Tsunade turned to him scowling. "You can't seriously be thinking of continuing this madness," called the blonde as A turned to her. "And what would you suggest? The plan is over, our forces have been all but slaughtered and even now may be being tortured for information," called back A, slamming fist onto the desk before him as Mei nodded slowly. "The Raikage is right, however, what the Hokage says is also true, simply rushing into action is what has brought us here to being with," stated Mei as Gaara nodded, idly rubbing at his head, looking over to see Temari's worried expression. "I feel we may have already called for a fight," whispered Gaara, looking around to Temari, who nodded sadly at his words. "The FTE, running at the first sign of trouble. We knew there could be losers, there are in all wars," stated Inoki as Tsunade rounded on him. "This was supposed to prevent a war, not start one, you bastard," roared the Hokage as Inoki tensed, preparing to yell back before A cut him off. "Enough, Tsunade, control yourself, we cannot change the past by attacking one another," called A as both Kages allowed themselves to relax slowly before Gaara spoke up. "So what do we do now? The West won't stay silent for long. I don't feel retreating is really an option anymore. If they want to come they could push straight to Suna, with as it is, reinforcing Temari's forces and waiting seems our only option," replied Mei as both A and Inoki nodded. "More forces? Are you wanting this to become a full war?" asked Tsunade as the others turned to her. "And what choice do we have now? Or do you think a discussion will fix this?" asked A as Tsunade glared across at the group. "Better to try than to march headlong into another war," replied Tsunade as the others fell silent. "Very well, Tsunade, since you feel it is the only choice, I propose you head to the fortress with the reinforcements. If the Emperor arrives you will carry our authority to end the matter personally. Is that acceptable?" asked Mei as across from her Inoki snorted. "Sending her alone, I will not hand my fate over to Konoha Mizukage, I will go as well," spoke Inoki as he looked around at the rest, who turned to face Tsunade. "Fine, but if you try and start a war one will personally kill you," threatened Tsunade as the old man glared at her for a moment before looking away. "Very well, Hokage, we will gather our forces, you will depart tomorrow, I wish you luck," finished Mei as the group disbanded, moving back towards their respective villages. A day later found Tsunade standing before the gates of Konoha, a mix of shinobi and kunoichi, pulled from all of the villages behind her massive columns, all ready to depart. As the Hokage looked to her left, she saw the pair standing beside her, meeting her gaze. Minato and Kushina had elected to accompany the woman, if only to have the chance to help retrieve Hinata from the west, though from their position, this was just another mistake on the part of the alliance. "I still don't like this, Tsunade," muttered Minato as his fellow blonde turned to him, nodding slightly as she turned her eyes between the pair. Neither do I, but we don't have a choice, it's our only chance to keep this from growing into a larger conflict. With any luck we can stop this here," replied the Hokage as despite herself Kushina found a small smile coming to her lips. "With your luck I don't know how great I feel about our chances," her words causing Tsunade to smile softly back at her. "I suppose, but it's this or leave the prisoners to the west. Sakura and Hinata are there now, and I refuse to lose another by my inaction," finished the Hokage, turning ahead as both Minato and Kushina nodded, moving up beside her. "Alright, but I hope it doesn't come to that, fighting the west, fighting the Emperor Nunnally and Colin, it just feels wrong," spoke Kushina as beside her Minato nodded, moving slightly closer to his wife. "Let's just make sure it doesn't come to that, besides I don't want to see you and Colin go at it for real, I'm afraid I wouldn't survive," smiled Minato as Kushina gave him a small punch to one arm as Tsunade motioned the forces forward. Soon enough the forces were rushing forward over the land out towards the west, where forces were already moving to greet them. Days hoping it wouldn't come to this, praying that it was somehow a mistake, but nothing in the end would change the truth. Blinking a few times, Naruto found himself looking up at the open sky as seen through a wall of glass. "So I guess I'm not that lucky," whispered Naruto, pushing himself up, his eyes looking around the observation deck, falling upon the form of Euphemia sitting a small distance away from where he had been resting. "Watching over me?" asked Naruto with a faint smile as the pink-haired girl offered him one of her own smile. "I guess you looked like you needed it," she replied as Naruto nodded, one armored hand running through his hair as he let out a heavy sigh. "I suppose I did, was half hoping that this was some kind of bad dream, you know," chuckled Naruto as Euphemia nodded, her hands gripping one another over her armored lap as she gave a sorrowful look out into the sky. "But that's not how things are playing out," finished Naruto, pushing himself up as he reached over to grab his helm from where it lay beside him as he gave the pink-haired woman a sad look. "You don't have to fight, I know it hurts to see them again, you try to hide it, but everyone can see it," replied the pink-haired woman turning to him as Naruto paused, letting out a tired breath as he raised a hand to scratch at the back of his head, a habit he had never managed to overcome even after all his time in the West. Yeah, but it would hurt more not to fight. What happened to me wasn't fair, but if I don't act now I'd be no better than those who left me to fend for myself. Hopefully once they have been pushed back we can end this, but we both know that allowing them to stay in the West is unacceptable. Whatever their intentions are, people have already suffered for this. Spoke Naruto as Euphemia nodded, rising slowly, her long hair waving out behind her as she nodded to him, the skies above starting to slow as the ship began its descent. Just try not to take the whole burden on your shoulders, alright Naruto-kun, remember we are here for you. Offered Euphemia as Naruto gave her a warm smile that reached up to his blue eyes even as they disappeared behind his crimson helm. I promise, and don't worry, you'll be back in the gardens giving Kurama 9 kinds of hell in no time. Replied Naruto as Euphemia offered a small smile. Hi, and don't forget when this is all over, I get to meet Hinata-chan. Nunnally told me all about her and little Menma, and I won't forgive you if I don't get my turn. Smiled the woman as Naruto let out a small chuckle, turning towards the door. I'll keep that in mind. Called back the blonde as he moved out of the room, steadily descending the ship until he was walking across the staging ground for their advance. As the crimson armored man stepped free from the ship, a contingent of white-clad soldiers stepped up around him, marching forward around him as he passed through the camp, men and women pausing as he passed to let out cheers or salutes. He returned as he moved towards the command center. As he entered the main area, constructed of an oversized tent, its flaps pulled back so as to allow some airflow that roamed over the large plains, Naruto found Lelouch, Colin and Cornelia waiting for him, all in full military gear, even as a few soldiers moved around them passing messages or simply securing materials. How are preparations? Asked Naruto as he stepped up to the table that showed the battle plans. We are ready, they are dug in pretty well, those Earth Justices are pretty good at forming defenses on the fly. Replied Lelouch as Naruto turned to him as he continued. We also spotted another force arriving a day ago to reinforce them, it looks like they plan to make a fight of this. Finished the man as Naruto nodded. I see, has there been any communication from them? As a matter of fact, one this morning, they requested a meeting with you, though I'm skeptical, it could just be a plan to take you out before the fighting begins, they specifically asked to speak with you. Replied Lelouch as Naruto nodded, turning to Cornelia. Your opinion? He asked as the woman sighed. As much as I'd love to simply throw their message away, it could be genuine. Besides, you were planning on offering them the chance to surrender anyway, weren't you? Smirked the woman as Naruto let out a sigh. Feels like old times already, replied the blonde, pausing for a few moments before letting out a heavy sigh. I'll see them, tell them to meet on the open plain before our forces, 3 per side, any others will be seen as an attack and dealt with accordingly. Spoke Naruto as Cornelia nodded, turning to bark out orders as beside her Colin turned to him. And if they don't want to leave? Asked the redeed as Naruto turned to Lelouch. Then we follow what you have predicted. Cornelia will direct our full forces to the front and Colin will take the right and I will have the left. Take the fort and surround them. Replied Naruto as the pair nodded. You know, I still think you should take a full company with you. Muttered Lelouch as Naruto chuckled. I think we both know I have plenty of forces myself, Lelouch, besides if I run into trouble I'm sure you'll think of something. Offered Naruto as the purple-eyed man sighed. I swear I'd hate you if you weren't always right. Replied Lelouch, offering a wicked smile that Colin shook her head at. Okay, come on creepy, you still have to get to airships, remember you're handling the oversight, and if I get left out there alone because you were chuckling about how clever you were, I'll kick your ass. Called Colin as Lelouch's smile paused before a small chuckle found its way to his lips, pushing out as he nodded to her. I'll keep it in mind, and Naruto, stay safe, alright. Called the man as he allowed himself to be led away from the tent. Meanwhile, within the captured fortress, Tsunade was looking over a battle plan of their own, cursing as reports came of the newest arrivals to the front. Across from her, Inoki sat, his eyes narrowed over the plans, every now and then shooting glares towards the pair of namikazes who stood in full battle dress across from him, both wearing the green and blue combination that identified them as Jonin of the Leaf, though noticeable absent were the headbands that identified them as such. As another report arrived, Tsunade pushed back from the table, letting out an audible groan of frustration. They just keep coming. At this rate they'll be able to just run over us. Muttered the woman as across from her Inoki scoffed. Hardly, our sensors have detected nothing like what we felt in Suna. It's likely they only have a handful of such warriors in their entire forces, the rest are likely cannon fodder to a shinobi. Called it Tsuchikage as across from him Kushina growled. Are you an idiot? One of those chakra-less fighters was the one who won the tournament, are you looking to get us all killed? Called the redeed as the shorter man growled back at her, a few stone shinobi moving around him as beside Kushina, Minato stepped up, his eyes narrowing upon the older man and his guards, as if daring them to make a move. Enough. Inoki, unless you have something useful to add, stop trying to start a fight here. Called Tsunade, gaining another glare from the man who nevertheless relented, his eyes turning as another shinobi arrived, passing a scroll to Tsunade. But now, another ship? Asked Minato, looking over at Tsunade as she shook her head. No, the Emperor has agreed to meet with us. He will be out in the plains in 1 hour. We are to send a delegation of 3 to discuss matters with him. Replied Tsunade, not believing that they might actually be able to keep from this mindless battle. You think he's serious? Asked Temari, stepping forwards as Minato sighed, nodding slowly. Hi, from when I meet him he seemed kind to keep his word. Besides, it's not like he couldn't just ignore our message. Spoke the blonde man as Tsunade nodded, looking around the table. Very well, Inoki, Temari and myself will go to meet him. In the meantime, Kushina, Minato, I want you two and a company on the right flank. Inoki, lead a company on the left as well. The rest will man the battlements in the front. If things don't work out, I want us prepared for a fight. Finished Tsunade as the group nodded. We could use this to our advantage, you know, if we capture the Emperor we could. Started Inoki before he was silenced by a scowl from Tsunade. Enough, I won't have you destroying the one chance we have to fix this mess, so just keep those thoughts to yourself. Called the blonde, gaining a glare from the older man before he turned to arrange his forces. As he departed, both Kushina and Minato turned to Tsunade, looking concerned. If there is a fight, I don't know if we can hold them. Spoke Minato as Tsunade nodded. Hi, I know, but there isn't many other options for us. If we get pushed back, get yourselves out of there, understand me, don't you dare leave Menmakun alone. Whispered Tsunade as both nodded, offering small smiles. You to Tsunade, after all he would miss his Bachan. Smiled Kushina as the pair gave a final nod, turning to depart as Tsunade moved out herself towards whatever awaited them upon the open western plains. An hour later found 2 groups standing across from one another in the open lands between the armies, the short wild grass brushing across their ankle as a stiff breeze blew across the field, causing Cornelia's white cape and Naruto's fox plume to wave out behind them. Colin simply standing at attention beside the pair, her gray-faced helm focused on the figures standing opposite them. Tsunade stood at the head, the small form of Inoki floating beside her, as Temari stood on her other side, all 3 allowing their eyes to drift over the armored forms before them. It is good to see you again, Emperor, though I wish it was under better circumstance. Greeted Tsunade as Naruto nodded. Stepping slightly forwards as he addressed her. I agree, Hokage-san, I had hoped that our lands could have been allies, yet it seems you had other plans. Replied Naruto as Tsunade nodded, looking across to Inoki, who had not taken his eyes from the Emperor. What has happened was a mistake, Emperor. We do not wish this to escalate further if we can avoid it. Replied the blonde as Naruto nodded. Agreed, I would prefer that there not be further conflict if possible. So I give you this chance, withdraw you forces from our lands, leave the fortress behind, and let us stop this now. Spoke Naruto as Tsunade felt a small flicker of hope blossom in her chest. However, before from beside her, Temari spoke up, drawing Naruto's attention around as he focused upon her. Before that, what happened to our forces? Over half of them weren't in the fortress when we arrived. Asked Temari as Naruto nodded to her as the others turned to face him. They are currently being detained as prisoners for their actions, they are unharmed at this time. Replied the crimson armored man as Tsunade let a small breath out she hadn't known she had been holding. Thank you, if you could release them, well will. Started the blonde, only for Naruto to cut her off. I am afraid that I will not discuss our prisoners further until your forces have withdrawn from my lands, Hokage. Once you have departed we may address their actions, but I will not debate such things while you occupy my lands. Replied Naruto as Inoki scoffed. And why should we believe that? Why should we even believe they are alive? Called the man as beside him Tsunade couldn't help but wonder the same as Naruto turned to face the man. Out of the 2 of us, Tsuchikage, I think my word is more trustworthy. Replied Naruto as Tsunade stepped forwards, her hands raised in a calming motion. Please, Emperor, if you can just show us some proof. She started as Naruto turned to her, his voice coming out in a small growl. Proof? You ask me to give you proof while you stand with an army upon our land after having attacked us over a matter of pride. Called Naruto, spitting the last word as Tsunade's eyes went wide. How? She started as Naruto cut her off. I received your reason for an attack from one of the captured prisoners. You would attack my home over a tournament and an argument over nothing, throw away the peace we offered for nothing. Called Naruto as Tsunade's eyes turned to Inoki, whose eyes narrowed at the man. And you would start one over the matter of a few prisoners, boy? Mocked the man as Naruto turned to him, his voice deadly calm. Do not think that I'm a fool, Inoki, whispered the man before turning to Tsunade, his tone still in that same emotionless state. You have one chance, Tsunade Senju, pull back you forces, leave my land, and we will not pursue you, you have my word. Do not, and we will be forced to remove you from our home. Finished the blonde as he watched the woman he had once thought of as a grandmother looking at him, stricken at what to do. Emperor, I ask again, please release the prisoners and we will withdraw. I cannot simply retreat on your word alone. Replied Tsunade sadly as Naruto nodded, letting out a mournful sigh. And I will not barter with you as an army stands on my land. Hokage-san, you have 1 hour to withdraw your forces, I pray you take it. Finished Naruto as Tsunade looked mortified at his words, slowly letting her head drop into a nod as she turned Inoki and Temari moving ahead of her back towards the fortress. Just as she was starting to move herself, a small whisper reached her ears, causing her to look back towards the 3 armored figures that had just turned themselves. For a moment she simply stared after them before she shook herself as she turned back towards the fortress, her mind too occupied with what she now faced to contemplate on the words further. Still. Granny. She was sure that was what she had heard, but why? Meanwhile, within the heart of the imperial capital, Hinata found herself being led out to the garden area by a pair of armored guards who halted as they reached the edge of the entrance, taking positions on either side, gesturing for the pale-eyed girl to continue forward alone. Still unsure as to what was awaiting her, Hinata turned to head down a small stone pathway, looking around at the lush gardens, their beauty bringing a small smile to her lips despite everything that was occurring in the world outside. Soon enough she found herself standing before a small white gazebo, its iron pillars wound with vines of delicate-looking flowers that alternated between softest pink and blazing purples, causing the whole structure to shine even amongst the beauty of the garden. Looking up, Hinata saw a small table sitting in the structure's center with a figure already waiting for her. CC watched as Hinata slowly moved up the stone path onto the gazebo's floor. As the pale-eyed girl stepped forward, CC held out a hand gesturing to the seat across from her that the girl sank into, blinking around, obviously more than a little lost as to what was occurring around her. You can relax, Hinata, I only wished to speak with you. Began CC, offering a small smile as Hinata nodded. I understand, but I don't know anything more than. She began as CC let out a small chuckle, fixing the woman across from her with a smirk. Oh, I don't care about Konoha or the elemental nations, no, what I want to know about is you. Replied CC, causing Hinata to look even more lost at her words. Me? But why? Asked Hinata as CC gave a small shrug as she lifted a teacup to her lips, sipping at it as she fixed the woman with her yellow eyes. Oh, just curious, I spoke with the Emperor about your meeting and I picked up on a few things that made me wonder just what you meant. After all, someone does not usually dislike their home if there isn't a reason. Finished CC as Hinata blinked at her, looking down sadly at her words. I see, replied the pale-eyed girl as CC set down her cup, sighing slightly. I know I can't force you to speak, and even if I could, the Emperor would likely not forgive me for it. He seems to be rather fond of you after all. Smiled the woman, causing Hinata to blush slightly at her words. Though I can see that he isn't the first one to make you feel like that. Continued CC as Hinata's face snapped up, her eyes wide. Oh, how? Hinata managed as CC smiled. Oh, I've been around long enough to see a few love-struck and heartbroken women, Hinata. Now the question is, does this have to do with why you dislike the village? Asked CC as Hinata looked away from her, slightly hesitating for a moment before nodding. What happened to him? Asked CC as Hinata paused for a moment, intent not to answer, till the fear and worry of the last few days seemed to compel her to do otherwise, and before she knew it, she was explaining everything from Naruto's life as a child, through his banishment and apparent treachery, and even about the return of his family. For her part, CC simply sat and listened, her eyes widening slightly at the news of the parents' return, shifting to a small smile at their reaction to his condition, and finally finishing with a knowing smirk as she saw the woman's true feeling on display before her. As Hinata's tale reached its end, CC let out a small chuckle, drawing a puzzled and slightly hurt expression from Hinata as she looked across at the woman, who raised a hand gently to stay Hinata's words. I'm sorry, Hinata, I wasn't laughing at you, more at the whole situation. To think Naruto had someone like you watching him all along and he never knew it, though I suspect that it wasn't too hard to remain unnoticed with him. Chuckled CC as Hinata blinked at her a few times, her heart beating faster as she shifted forwards. You know Naruto, is he safe? Where is he? Asked Hinata hurriedly, her desire to know practically flooding off of her as CC offer a coy smile. What do you say, Kurama, should I tell her or would you like to? Called CC as Hinata looked to the woman, puzzled as she appeared to be speaking to thin air. Before Hinata could ask just who the woman was speaking to, a deep voice spoke up, drawing Hinata's eyes around as she froze at the figure before her. As if I could stop you if you wanted to tell her yourself. Still, after all that, just get it over with. Spoke Kurama, moving up the steps, his face turned towards CC as behind him 9 tails waved gently in the breeze, drawing Hinata's eyes for a moment before her mouth opened slightly as comprehension touched her mind. Kentucky QP. The pale-eyed woman whispered as the kitsune turned to her, offering a vulpine grin. Well, a bit informal, I prefer the great QB no kitsune, but I suppose it will do. Replied the fox as Hinata stared at the fox before turning to CC, who offered a small smirk at the expression on Hinata's face. Well, Hinata-chan, you've told me quite a story, so how about I return the favor? It concerns a blonde-haired man we both care for very deeply. Spoke CC as Kurama moved over to sit beside her as Hinata turned between the two, dumbstruck at what she was seeing, even as CC began her story. So that's how it is, muttered the crimson-armored man as he stepped forward through the plains, his armored feet stamping the grass flat as he marched slowly towards the enemy line, where he could distantly see figures dashing back and forth. Across the soon-to-be battlefield, Naruto could see as the airships began to rise, Cornelia calling the forces forwards as armored figures leveled kunai and chakra cannons, moving forwards flanked by others carrying blades in their hands, all moving steadily forwards towards the shinobi who rushed between their fortifications, watching the might of the West come to bear before them. No, don't think about that now, you have your own part to play, the others will be fine. Thought Naruto as he stepped forwards, his fox plume waving out behind him as he reached back to unfasten his blade, letting it fall into his hand, moving it beside him still in its smaller form as he continued to march forward alone across the plain. The sun glinting off of his crimson form as he focused forwards, allowing the anger to flow gently over him, his body tense at the battle to come. Remember what you have been taught. Thought Naruto, taking steady breaths, his mind showing him the flash of his training that always came to him before battle. Idiot, anger is fine, use it, it's part of you. A doll is not good on a battlefield. The echo of Kurama's words bringing a small smile to Naruto's face, even as he raised his blade up, as with a pulse of chakra, the blade shot out, growing to its full size, as he slung it over beside him, the hum of the blade, sending a few blade of grass up into the wind, as he came to stop, looking across the field to where the shinobi were doubtless watching him. At that moment, behind a raised patch of earth, a few shinobi looked out, spotting the single crimson figure out on the horizon, a few looking around to one another in obvious confusion. What the hell? One guy, are they stupid? Those bakas aren't taking us serious. Whatever, let's just kill him and be done with it. Came several voices as up and down the line Kunoichi and shinobi turned to one another. Among the ranks, two figures looked out silently, both feeling an odd prickling working its way up their spines, even as they focused on the figure. It's him, but why is he alone? I don't like this. Muttered Minato as beside him Kushina nodded, looking around to her husband with a slightly concerned look on her face. Minato, something is wrong, I can feel it. Whispered Kushina as the blonde man nodded beside her, looking back out as the emperor raised his blade up pointing to the sky as his other arm came around, overlapping his fingers in some kind of sign. Wait, that looks like. Whispered Minato before he suddenly went wide-eyed. No, everyone get ready, we have incoming. Cried Minato as the forces up and down the line look up to their commander in confusion. However, before they could begin to ask why, there was an eruption of smoke around where the lord stood, seeming to stretch from horizon to horizon. As the defenders turned, they felt their heart stop as a gust of wind caught the smoke, pulling it away to show a crimson army before them, each stamping the grass below them flat as they pulled their own blades to bear, an audible sound of shifting armor and waving blades reaching them as they started to move forward. Marching at first but steadily gaining speed until they were flying forward, the thundering of their footsteps shaking a few loose stone around the defenders as the wave of armored forces rushed towards them at speeds that put many of the jonin among their ranks to shame. "Here Kami," whispered Kushina as she saw the force of armored figures charging them, even as shinobi all up and down the line began to fling anything they could towards the advancing wave. Within the crimson wave, Naruto rushed beside a pair of his clones, swiping his blade forwards, smashing a blast of rock aside, causing it to pitch into the air, even as he pelted forwards, his free right hand already building chakra, as all along his line clones, fueled by the pure power of Kurama, and himself did likewise, balls of blackened power, springing to life in hundreds of gauntleted hands that as one rose, pointing forwards towards the line ahead of them. "And no, everyone get back," cried Minato even as he grabbed onto Kushina, vanishing in a flash of yellow as the sea of clones let those balls of blackened power fling themselves forwards towards the defensive walls. Many of the shinobi rushed back, diving into the trenches of the second line, while still others refused to retreat, flinging justices and weapons forwards even as death closed in on them. Just as Minato and Kushina reappeared in a flash of light, a sound like that of 100 thunderclaps rolled across the plains as they turned to see the entire front lines disappearing in a wall of explosions, figures flinging themselves back from the blasts, even as others were simply engulfed by the horrible force of the blasts. Soon the front line was nothing but a sea of smoke and shattered stone as the remaining forces looked on in horror at what they were seeing. "Impossible," stammered a Kiri shinobi looking over the field before him before he froze, as did other, as from the smoke emerged the crimson figures still charging forwards. As the first pushed through the smoke, a tri-pronged kunai came whistling forwards, catching the first crimson figure in the throat, causing him to stagger before disappearing into a wisp of smoke as Minato roared out at the forces around him. "Don't let them close in, they are clones, take them out now." roared the man as he flung a wave of wind forwards that smashed into another armored figure, causing him to stagger before a golden chain shot forwards, punching a hole in his chest, causing him to vanish into his own puff of smoke. As Naruto saw two of his clones fall, his helm turned forwards towards the second line, even as his force charged onwards, their feet pounding over the first trenches. As he brought his blade up beside him, his gaze focused on the pair that were rallying the troops, his eyes widening slightly before hardening as he saw who they were. Damn it, thought the man, sending a message to his clones to focus on the other forces as he turned slightly to rush towards the blonde and crimson pair as he pushed through the cloud of smoke. As the battle erupted upon her left flank, Tsunade found herself watching as a wave of armored figures closed on her own forces, a variable storm of kunai and fire flying into the defensive walls as the Western nation's army continued to pelt the defenders from what must have been thousands of kunai launchers and chakra cannons. Damn it! Cried Tsunade as she saw a shinobi jump up to send a dragon of flame forwards that smashed into the advancing force, scattering dozens, even as the shinobi was then squired by a storm of kunai, in return dead before his body even reached the ground. Stay behind cover. Wait for them to close. Roared Tsunade as beside her an earth kunoichi brought up a wall of earth just as a smattering of metal sank into it, drawing a small cry of shock from her lips. Earth users, give you some cover. Cried the sage as a smattering of shinobi rushed forwards to the line, a few dropping from blasts of kunai. Falling to the ground in pain even as most arrived, beginning to fly through seals, their hands slamming into the ground as all along the line, a roar went up as a crashing tremor went out, cracking the earth, suddenly surging up into great mountains, structures that punched into the lines of the Western forces, flinging armor-clad figures up, while others pushed back, finding themselves in the valleys created by the latest attack. Now well, they are divided. Roared Tsunade as she pushed herself up and forwards, the shinobi roaring beside her as they rushed forward, smatterings of kunai and fires blasting into them, but lacking the mass it had possessed before as the shinobi used the new terrain to their advantage, leaping up the walls, mountains of earth as they dove into the armored forces, who turned to meet them full force. As Tsunade came charging around one corner, she watched as Iwa shinobi was blasted back by wide armored figures holding a massive cannon that spat another stream of fire into an advancing Kiri Kunoichi. Before the cannon went silent, the armored figure swinging it around to smash into an advancing shinobi. The weapon shattering upon the figure's hardened skin as he smashed a fist into the white figure in return, sending him back into a pillar of stone, a spider web of cracks shooting up it before he disappeared behind the mass of battling figures. Even as Tsunade turned to slam a fist into another armored figure, she was forced to jump aside as a golden lance smashed into the ground where she had been standing, drawing her eyes up to see a purple armored figures rushing down a mountainside towards her, a company of wide armored figures all around her sporting similar lances. Cornelia rushed down, her hands clasping around her own lance as she leveled it towards the blonde woman, pelting forwards as she saw several shinobi gathering around the woman. Soon two small forces were crashing towards one another until they collided in a storm of kunai, justice and blades. Cornelia was forced to push herself sideways as a hammering fist from the blonde crashed into the ground where she had been standing a moment before, sending stone flying to shatter upon her armor, even as she swung her lance around, only to see the woman smash a backhanded strike into the weapon, caving in one side of it and forcing it back with enough force to send it spinning free of her grip. As a second blow came thundering around, the purple armored figures dove forwards, causing the blow to glance off one shoulder, sending chunks of her armor flying, even as with a roar she smashed into the blonde woman, taking her off of her feet as the pair crashed out of the melee into a small open valley between the battling forces that seemed somehow deserted. As the pair crashed into the area, Cornelia found herself rolling over her targets, crashing to her back before she rolled, coming to her feet, just as across from her the blonde did likewise. "Oh, you fight well, not unlike that pink-haired girl," breathed Cornelia as Tsunade stiffened at her words. "Sakura, you," she began as Cornelia drew a pair of blades from her back, readying herself as a set of seals began to glow along their length. "You taught here well, but let's see what you can do," called Cornelia as she sprang ahead, swiping a blade forwards that Tsunade leapt back to avoid before she brought a fist around, aiming to cave in the armored figure's breastplate. But as her blow came, it found the crossed blades of the woman rising to meet it, the impact sending her feet skidding back a few feet as the seals along the blades erupted into life, but remained intact as Cornelia flashed a grin from behind her helm, even as her arms felt like falling off. "Not this time, Kunoichi," cried Cornelia as she rushed forwards across from her, Tsunade doing likewise as the valley erupted into a battle devastating power. 0. Across the battlefield where the shinobi forces were first beginning to buckle under the onslaught, Minato and Kushina found themselves flinging kunai, chains, as well as blasts of water and wind at crimson figures that rushed past them, crashing into the shinobi around them, driving them aback, even as more of them exploded into clouds of smoke. As Kushina speared another pair of crimson figures, she saw one sweep a blade around, smashing it through Kiri Shinobi's blade, opening up a crimson line across his chest, before an armored fist followed it up, flinging the man back, just as one of Minato's kunai slammed into the armored form's back, causing it to vanish in another cloud of smoke. All around them their line had crumbled, many already rushing back as crimson figures continued to fling themselves into them, ignoring the pair of namikazes as they did. "Why the hell are they ignoring us?" called Kushina, looking around to Minato, who seemed just as confused as they found themselves almost alone, as a few more armored figures disappeared over the third line of defense. Just as the pair were about to turn to pursue, a voice rang out, drawing the pair's eyes around to see the crimson figures standing before them, his fox plume waving out, even as Helm turned to face them, the blade in his hand held to one side. "They are simply following my orders," spoke Naruto as the pair turned to face him from across the broken battlefield. Why order that?" called Minato as Naruto looked slowly between the pair, a frown upon his lips as he spoke. "Because I want you to leave, go now," replied Naruto as the two looked confused as Naruto watched them, letting out a heavy breath. "I do not wish to rob Menma of his parents over this conflict. No child deserves to be denied their parents' love, no one," whispered Naruto, his mind flashing past his own childhood as both namikazes looked on, no believing what they were hearing. "And what about everyone else on this battlefield?" called Kushina as Naruto turned his helm to her, his voice coming out firm but carrying the sadness he felt at his words. "I cannot save everyone, Kushina. I have only done what is necessary to protect my home and those I love. Now please go back to your son," replied Naruto, a small note of pleading in his voice as the two looked at him for a moment before shifting slightly into combat stances. "I'm sorry, Emperor, but to end this war here we can't do that. Surrender to us here and we can stop all of this," replied Minato as Naruto shifted his footing, bringing his blade around to lay horizontally behind him as he took a two-handed grip. "Very well, Minato Kushina, it seems I will have to convince you another way. I pray you survive this," spoke Naruto before he shot forwards, his blade swiping out, cleaving clear through the defensive wall beside the namikazes, as though it wasn't there, even as the pair vanished in a flash of yellow light. Naruto had only a second as his senses screamed at him to move as he swung his blade around just in time to parry a pair of golden chains that sent up sparks as they crashed over his blade, sending up a grinding cry as they plunged past him. Heaving back, Naruto swung his sword up before crashing it back down, severing the chains that fell limply to the ground, even as he spun, looking back to where Kushina stood flying through seals as a dragon made of water roared to life behind her before flying forwards, its jaws open in a gurgling howl. As the water dragon crashed forwards, Naruto spun around, charging ahead, slamming straight into the creature. Kushina's eyes widened as she saw her dragon shattering against the crimson figures, armor seals blazing to life as the water rushed over him, his blade dragging the ground as he pelted forwards towards her, one arm raised into a fist as he closed on her. Just as Naruto blasted through the other end of the water dragon, a kunai went flying past him a second before a flash of yellow caused him to spin, just as Minato slammed a Rasengan into his chest, a grinding sound of metal ringing across the plains before with another flash Kushina, and he vanished just as the ball of chakra detonated into a blue explosion of force that sent stone and dust flying. As they landed a few feet away, turning back towards the site. "Is he?" asked Kushina as Minato shook his head. "No, he's still standing. I don't think we can hold back here, Kushina," spoke Minato as Naruto stepped out of the dusk, a billowing cape of chakra waving behind him as across his armor flecks of it waved from the chakra metal and seals so that the crimson figure seemed to be made of radiating crimson energy. As the namikazes watched, Naruto raised his blade back to his side before lowering himself once again, looking across at them before taking off like a rocket once again as they swung to meet him. 0. Meanwhile, upon the final front, Inoki found himself watching in disbelief as the armored forces of the Empire overran his forward line, shinobi scattering before them, even as from the air figures swept down, spraying a sea of kunai and fire down into his forces. This can't happening, I won't let you," roared the old man, raising his hands as a shimmering light gathered around his hands, blossoming into a sudden cylinder of light that rocketed up into the sky, carving a hole through one airship's wing, cutting it cleanly away and sending the ship spiraling down to skip across the plains, crashing into the bordering forest, even as a smile spread over the old man's face. From one of the ships above, a black-haired youth suddenly turned towards the source of the blast, his eyes narrowed on the old man as he barked out a series of orders to the fleet. Below, Inoki's smile faded just as quickly as it had appeared as from the remaining ships, giant cannons like the ones he saw some of the armored solders carrying suddenly swung around to point towards his forces as a thunderous storm of sound erupted above them, pillars of lightning lashing down upon the field, carving their way forwards, cutting cleaning through his lines, even as a few shinobi flung mountains of flame and dragons of light back at the flying fortresses, sending explosions across them even as more fire poured down from them. As Inoki watched one of those cannons swivel to face him, his eyes widening as he threw himself into the sky just as the area around him disappeared in a blast fire, even as he was forced to dodge left as a flock of armored figures swooped down pelting kunai towards him as he was forced to fly back to avoid the metal death. As aboard the ships, Lelich let out a confident smirk, seeing the one who had harmed his sister being pushed back. At the same time below upon the battlefield, a red armored woman was slamming a clawed hand into a shinobi's chest, flinging them back in a small spray of crimson. As Colin turned back towards the front, she found herself caught in a blast of wind that threw her off of her feet, flying back to smash through an earthen defensive wall, rolling a few times before coming to her feet, turning to face a blonde woman swinging an oversized fan towards her once again, as blades of wind pelted forwards, gouging long claw marks in the earth as the shot towards her. As the blast approached, Colin leapt slightly, snapping a seal to life on her armor, as thin slabs of woven chakra metal burst from her back, just as the winds caught her. Instead of crashing her off her feet, however, the blast caught the new addition, flinging them out as a sea of seals blazed to fiery light along them, spreading the fabric out like the wings of some Valkyrie of the battlefield as she took to the air, spinning as she did to point her two gauntlets down, losing two steams of molten steel down towards her attacker, forcing Tamari to abandon her fan as she dove back, crashing to the ground as she did. Looking up, Tamari froze as Colin swept forwards, triggering another blast of molten steel down towards the woman, even as a mass of steel and wood suddenly leapt before her, sending up a splintering crash as it took the impact, a voice calling out to her from behind. "Tamari, get out of here, get whoever you can and retreat," roared Kankuro as he swung what was left of his broken puppet skywards, to see it shatter under another blow from Colin, causing broken bits of wood and steel to fall around him, even as he swung out another pair of scrolls that blasted to life as a redeeded figure puppet, sporting a pair of spinning blades on its back. And a pair of robed puppets sprang to life as the three charged skywards, dancing in and outs of one another, firing kunai and chakra blades up at Colin, who dove to avoid the attack as she hurtled to attack the new enemies. "Kankuro, you can't," started Tamari as she saw her brother offer her a pained smile as her eyes fell to a pair of kunai sticking out of one of his legs. "Shut up and get out of here, I'll buy you some time, but get as many as you can out," yelled Kankuro as his hands danced forwards as his puppets flying forwards, flinging everything they had to push the armored forces back, even as Tamari felt her chest tightened as she tore her eyes away from her brother. "Damn it, you better not die on me," roared Tamari as she pushed herself up, moving back, signaling everyone that was left to fall back as well, a general retreat sounding all along the line, even as Kankuro felt his leg give out as he dropped to one knee, smirking as he saw his sister escaping behind him. "Mangara's going to kill me over this," muttered the man as he focused back at the armored force that was even then marching towards him, as above the shadow of airships fell over him. "Aw, but hell, at least I get to use these," smirked the man as he saw the red armored figures tear his three puppets apart as he drew his final scroll, swiping it out as the final gift of his master bust to life. 10 white puppets blasted out, each turning to face the advancing force as behind them Kankuro smirked. "Well, come on then and see my puppet show," cried the man as the chattering dolls flung themselves forwards into the advancing force. As the line crumbled along one side, Tsunade was forced to jump back as a spray of kunai fire pushed her apart from the purple armored figure, who now sported a broken arm but seemed to have hardly noticed as their battle had continued forwards. Just as Tsunade was about to charge back, and a group of shinobi rushed forwards around her. "Hokage-sama, the right flank has collapsed," called a Konoha shinobi as Tsunade spun to him with a look of horror. "What? Damn it, sound the retreat. What about the left?" called Tsunade as she and the shinobi began to race back, outpacing the armored attackers as all around them waves of shinobi flew back around the devastated battlefield, some carrying injured comrades or simply dragging themselves out. "No word from them," called back a shinobi as Tsunade bit back another curse, changing her course as she charged towards the left flank, yelling back as she did. "Get everyone back, order the medical teams to stay to help the injured, surrender if they have to, but keep as many alive as you can," roared Tsunade as she pelted off across the battlefield. At the same time, behind her, wide armored figures were dropping around Cornelia, who pushed one back from her, gritting her teeth against the pain in her arm as she looked around at her forces. "General, the enemy is in retreat, should we pursue?" called a Solider as Cornelia turned to face him, about to order them onwards, before she stopped, pulling her anger back as she let out a pained breath. "No, gather our forces and regroup, leave the fortress to Lelich, get the injured to the rear, and get a force out to capture survivors," ordered Cornelia as around her the soldier saluted, rushing off to complete her orders as a pair fell in beside her as she moved back through the lines. Above the battlefield within one of the massive airships, Lelich watched as the enemy flanks collapsed on all sides, the forces fleeing as their own soldiers halted their advance, even as detachments rushing out to get the injured, as well as removing a few pockets of resistance here and there. "Status report," called Lelich, turning to a soldier who snapped out a salute. Sir, infantry is unknown as of yet, but we have lost the Morning Glory and 4 more of our ships need to land for repairs," replied the man as Lelich looked back out at the battlefield before nodding. "Pull back the injured ships and dispatch his team to the Glory's crash site to help the survivors. The rest of our fleet will move over the fortress, but do not engage unless fired upon," ordered the man as the Sada rushed to relay his orders. Idly Lelich turned his gaze to the right flank as his thoughts turned to how the Emperor was faring. As the battle was finally coming to a close across the fronts, a force of armored soldiers with Colin at the head pushed through the gates of the fortress, turning to see a staging area deserted, except for what appeared to be medical personnel rushing back and forth to help the shinobi and Kunoichi scattered all around. As her force entered, Colin spied a bandaged man pushing himself up, one arm in a sling, his feral face turning into a growl as he saw a massive white dog moving up beside him, seeming ready to attack before a yell drew his attention around. "Cut the shit, Kibba, we don't have time for that," yelled a blonde-haired girl as she pushed 2 hands covered in green chakra onto a figure's body, glancing up at Colin's group as she did. "Well shit, look, we surrender or whatever, but these people need medical care," roared Ino as Colin stepped forwards, her metallic wings folding behind her as she glanced around once before turning back to Ino, as behind her armored figures moved up, their cannons still at hand, but lowered away from the wounded forces. "Good cause, I don't feel like picking on the injured, tell everyone to surrender their weapons, and you will not be harmed," spoke Colin as Ino nodded even as the shinobi and Kunoichi looked around before dropping their packs, those that could raising their hands in surrender, as the armored troops moved into to secure them, Colin turning to Ino once again. "Hey, we need to get to the injured out there, so get a squatter guards whatever you want, but we need to get the wounded back here," called the blonde as she finished mending one shinobi moving towards another, as Colin found herself smirking at the blonde's attitude. "Sounds fair, but we have injured as well, we will bring everyone here, expect our own medical corps as well," replied Colin as Ino nodded, moving to another figure. "Fine," called Ino as she moved to close a wound on a member of the Inyazuka clan. 000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000 as Naruto slammed a ball of blackened chakra into Minato's Rasengan, the 2 forces as Naruto slammed a ball of blackened chakra into Minato's Rasengan, the 2 forces crushing against one another till an explosion of force erupted. Minato vanishing in a flash of yellow even as Naruto was sent skidding back, a few cracks running down his armored gauntlet even as it closed around another of the tri-pronged kunai, shattering it before flinging it down to the scarred land now decorated with dozens of the broken blades. Even as he threw down the blade, he found his sword arm bound in a pair of golden chains, drawing his head around to see Kushina pulling a kunai armed with a paper bomb out from her pack. Seeing this, Naruto swung his bound arm forward, yanking the reed off of her feet, the kunai falling to the ground as it sent her flying forwards, as the crimson armored man spun his fist coming around to crash into her face. Even as his own blow fell, Kushina's free hand came crashing around as well, smashing into his helm, denting the metal in as the seals began to weaken, his own fist sending her flying back as her chains shattering, even as he staggered back from her own blow. As Kushina flew back, Naruto's helm jerked back just in time to see a flash of yellow light as he flung himself backwards, his cape billowing out as Minato's Rasengan went sweeping over him. But just as the attack missed, a second flash of light put the blonde man directly above Naruto, the orb now crashing down into his chest, forcing him down with a thunderous explosion as his blade whipped around, catching Minato across the chest before, with a flash of light, he flickered to his wife's side, clutching at the shallow wound across his chest. "Kushina!" cried Minato in fear as Kushina sat up, her cheek bright red and a small trail of blood leaking from one side of her mouth as she looked up to her husband. "I'm fine, but darn, he hits like an anvil," remarked the redeed as across the field they saw the armored figure wrenching himself out of the small crater, his armor showing cracks in places, but otherwise holding from the onslaught the two were providing. As they watched, the Emperor raised a hand, moving it over the dented helm, letting out a small tired chuckle as he did. I could say the same for you, Kushina, you know," called Naruto as he raised his blade back up, looking across as Kushina pushed herself up as well, smirking across at Naruto as a few more chains clinked free from her, moving to point towards him. Well, there's more where that came from, you know," called back Kushina as Naruto let out a breath, his gaze shifting as he distantly saw the airships moving over the fortress. "Looks like the others have already finished the fight. Still, I don't think these two will leave even if they knew that," thought Naruto, turning back to the pair as he let out a heavy breath, mentally dispelling his remaining clones as he broke off pursuit of the retreating forces. Across from him, Minato and Kushina were panting slightly as Minato pulled out his final kunai, silently cursing at how the fight was going. It seemed the Emperor had managed to figure out he needed his kunai to move around the field and had been smashing them at every opportunity, a few times actually taking a hit just to get at the weapon, and unfortunately it had worked, depleting the number 2 near nothing. Beside him, Kushina was faring a bit better, though even her reserves were dropping quickly, her chains taking a lot out of her as she had to replace them every time the armored figure broke them. At this point both Namikazes knew that this fight was not theirs to win, nothing they threw was enough to put the Emperor down, and it was only through luck that one of his devastating blows hadn't landed on them yet, and worse, he seemed to be getting faster as the battle continued, like he was learning how they fought. "Minato," whispered the Redeed as her husband nodded. Looking across at the armored figure who brought his blade up once more, preparing to spring forwards at them once again. "I know, Kushina-chan. I think we may have to get out of here," replied Minato even as the armored figure charged again, his blade held out beside him, whistling as it swung forwards. Before either Namikaze could begin to move, however, a sudden blast of smoke exploded to life before them as a titanic blue and white slug burst to life, taking the slash from the Emperor's blade before scattering into a wave of smaller slugs that fell around them as Tsunade charged into sight. "Minato, Kushina, get out of here, we're retreating," yelled Tsunade as she skidded to a halt before the pair, her eyes darting over their injured forms before turning, her heart stopping as she saw the crimson form standing across from the small sea of slugs. "Tsunade, but," started Kushina before the sage turned to face her, cutting her off. "Damn it, Kushina, I am not going to explain to Menma that his parents were captured. Now get moving now. Minato," roared the blonde woman as Minato gave the Hokage a nod as he moved beside his wife. "Tsunade," called Kushina as the blonde woman offered her a small smile, turning back to face back to where Naruto stood watching them. "Just get out of her, I'll catch up," called Tsunade as the pair looked at her horrified. "Tsunade, we," started Minato as the Hokage slammed a foot down into the earth, sending cracks all along her as she barked out at the pair. "Oh, we can't get out with him at our backs, now follow your Hokage's orders," called Tsunade as the pair of Namikazes looked to her back before Minato nodded. "Hi Hokage-sama, thank you," whispered the man as he and Kushina vanished into a flash of light, leaving Tsunade facing the Emperor, who stepped slowly forwards towards her. "So you wish this to continue?" stated Naruto, drawing his blade back behind him as Tsunade fixed her gaze upon him, shaking her head. "No, even if I wanted to fight you, I doubt I would last even half the time those two did," replied the woman as Naruto paused, watching her for a moment before his blade lowered. "I see, so you wish to surrender yourself," stated the armored figure as Tsunade nodded. "For your word the injured and prisoners will be unharmed and that you won't pursue the retreating forces," replied Tsunade, watching as the Emperor's blade shrunk down as he swept it onto his back, still watching the woman before him. "You have my word, scatter your slugs to the injured, all of them," ordered Naruto as Tsunade nodded, the summons vanishing in small puffs of smoke as they appeared around the battlefield, attaching themselves to any shinobi or imperial soldier they could, stabilizing them as they did. As they disappeared, Naruto turned towards the fortress, moving forwards as he glanced back to the blonde woman. "There are still more injured, follow," called the man as Tsunade moved after him, her eyes looking out towards the east as she did. "I'm sorry Minato, Kushina, this was all I could do," thought the woman as she turned to follow after the Emperor. Soon enough the pair were moving through the fortress's gate, Tsunade looking around in shock as medical shinobi alongside the Empire's own rushed back and forth to the injured as a few armored guards stood sentinel, still others helping however they could or bringing in more injured. "Hey," called a voice that drew Tsunade's eyes around to see Ino pushed back from the shaking body of a black-clothed figure by an armor-clad pink-haired woman who pushed her own hands over the man, a light blue wave of chakra moving out over him, stitching his wounds closed as his painted face let out a staggered breath. "Go and help another, I can handle the severe cases," snapped Euphemia as Ino blinked at her in shock before nodding dumbly, moving over to another table, helping to close a cut across an imperial soldier. As she saw this, Tsunade turned to the Emperor, who met her gaze, nodding. "Well, you have work to do, save as many as you can," spoke the man before he turned from her. Tsunade watched him for a heartbeat before turning to move into the medical area, rushing to help who she could. Following the battle's conclusion, the Empire's forces set up a perimeter reinforcing the fortress, even as across their border, similar forces moved to prepare for any counterattack that might arrive. Thanks to the efforts of the medical corps, many who might have died were spared that grisly fate. Soon the captured forces were moved back into the Empire, their chakra sealed, while the heavily injured were moved to the capital for observation. Cornelia insisted on remaining on the front, sending Euphemia back with Colin, as Lelich organized the air forces along their border before returning as well. Meanwhile, Tsunade found herself standing under guard as she stepped out of an airship onto the stone of the palace's airfield, under the watchful eye of several armored figures, even as beside her the Emperor marched ahead of her. He had informed her that until contact was made with the East, she would be held within the capital, and that any action taken would result in equal force against the forces captured during the battle. So Tsunade moved forward silently as the group passed into the palace, her eyes casting around at the carpeted halls and pillared arcades, finding herself in wonder despite her situation. As the group moved into the throne room, Tsunade froze as she saw Nunley seated beside a green-haired woman she didn't recognize, and Hinata, called Tsunade happily as the pale-eyed woman offered her a smile before she turned to face the armored figures, a look of hopeful longing upon her face. As Tsunade turned, she saw the crimson helm of the emperor turning to look at Hinata before shifting to the green-haired woman who nodded slightly as though answering a silent query. Naruto turned his eyes away from the smirking CC to gaze into Hinata's face, seeing the open emotion there as her eyes watched him. She isn't afraid of me, thought Naruto, as Hinata took a few tentative steps forwards towards the armored man, the guards parting at a sign from CC. After a few steps Hinata stood before him, her eyes looking up through the slits in his helm, as small tears blossomed at the edges of her eyes, her voice coming out in a small whisper. "Na Naruto-kun." Her words causing the man's heart to throb, as across from him Tsunade turned suddenly, her eyes widening, as her mind took in the pale-eyed girl's words, as they snapped into place beside what she already knew. Gee granny no Naruto he couldn't be, thought Tsunade, even as Naruto reached up to pull off his helm, allowing the whiskered cheeks and familiar blonde mop of hair to show, his blue eyes moving slowly down to meet the pearls of lavender that were Hinata's own. As the helm fell away, Hinata found her breath catching as she looked upon her first love, her mind taking in his new appearance, even as her heart willed her forwards. The next moment she had flung herself forwards, her arms wrapping around the blonde's neck as she pulled herself into him, flecks of tears falling around her as she began to cry, holding him, as he slowly reached his arms around to hold her as well. "I'm sorry Hinata-chan, I couldn't," whispered Naruto as Hinata's head shook even as she buried it into his neck, her voice coming out cutting him off. I thought you," she cried, squeezing him tighter as Naruto found a smile moving across his lips. "I know I'm sorry Hinata-chan," replied the blonde holding the sobbing woman as he looked around to see Tsunade staring at him, small tears falling from her eyes as she saw the boy she loved now a man looking at her. "Hey granny," spoke Naruto softly as he offered her a small smile that caused the blonde woman to choke out a breath, raising a hand to cover her mouth as her own tears joined those of Hinata and Naruto. "Jigaki." She managed as Naruto nodded. "Hi granny," replied Naruto as Tsunade took a few shaking steps forwards before she found herself rushing forward, flinging her arms around the boy she thought lost, not caring he was the emperor, not caring that she was a prisoner, not caring for the wars and the world or what was to come, simply marveling in the miracle that was the boy before her. As CC and Nunley watched smiling happily at the reunion before them. Chapter end. Alright, that's it for today's video guys, let me know in the comments section how was the story, and also don't forget to like, share and subscribe. I will meet you in another video, peace out.